All right, well, welcome everyone. I apologize once again for the technical issues we're having. The person that used to coordinate the Zoom links took on a different position inside UNL, and it took a little bit of time to get that straightened out. But with regard to this presentation and all of our land management quarterly presentations, they will be recorded. So after this meeting is over, we'll have our technology specialist, Ryan Evans, will go out and actually send out a link to this. As we're going along today, you're more than welcome to ask questions. Allan Vyhnalek should be joining us. He also had some computer issues this morning. So if he can't make it on, I'll cover everything, but I believe he can. So we'll just start rolling through the slides and see where we go. First thing, my name is Jim Jansen. My contact information is located on the left-hand side of the screen. Please feel free to reach out via email or phone number if you'd like. And then our right-hand side, the co-host for today is Allan Vyhnalek. He works on farm succession transition issues here at the University of Nebraska, and his contact information can be found there as well. The farm real estate page is on the bottom left-hand corner of the slide. That's where all the information related to land values or maybe more interest cash rental rates may be found. And then we also have Allan's farm succession and transition page. That's on the lower right-hand corner. Okay. And just wanted to put a plug in. Sam Zock with Zag Land Company. They are a farm and ranch management, brokerage, consulting, anything related to land management in the state of Nebraska. Sam, a young professional here in the state, he started a business located outside of Columbus near Humphrey, Nebraska. And part of the financial support to help cover the costs of putting these webinars on, he helped out with that today. Sam's a great person. We appreciate their support. If you're an agribusiness professional and you'd like to be featured as a sponsor for one of our webinars, feel free to reach out to me and we can be more than happy to work with you on this. But once again, the sponsorship helps cover the costs associated with doing this webinar, as well as the mailing associated with the annual land survey. So the basic outline that we have for today is broke down here into kind of three parts. First part, we'll be taking a look at what actually was reported as part of the preliminary estimates on land values and cash rental rates. And how do we account for some of these changing prices? The markets have been substantially impacted by some of the things that we're seeing to the price of corn, soybeans, cattle, all these things. How do you figure that into the cash rental rate? Second part today, Allan will be taking a look at communication and decision making. Without a doubt, there's a lot of things happening inside the ag industry. Whether you're landlord or tenant, we have rising input expenses, maybe much higher crop prices than what you might have anticipated a year or two ago. And we also have a lot of concerns related to drought. There's been areas of the state that have gotten rain, but obviously we're still maybe in a deficit relative to our historic average with rainfall. So how do you factor all those things in? And we had a couple of questions sent into us. We'll be sure to review those and review any questions that may have come in as we're progressing through the webinar today. So first part, trends in cash rental rates related to land in Nebraska for 2022. A few things, our survey, many folks on this call have seen this slide before, but those that are new, we'll just highlight it briefly. We do a survey of the people that work in the land industry, people that have firsthand knowledge related to the transactions related to sales, purchases, people that are financing agricultural operations that would be aware of cash rental rates. Based on their estimates that are sent in, typically in mid-March each year, we shoot for that mid-March timeframe, we publish what is referred to as the preliminary estimates. And then the final report is published in June. The final report has much additional detail beyond that, as things like what percent of land in Nebraska is financed via a contract for deed or a cash sale or a mortgage. All the information related to land values or cash rental rates may be found at cap.unl.edu/real estate. Once again, that's cap.unl.edu/real estate. So basics on how we break the state down. Here in the state of Nebraska, we summarize the information by quadrant or region of the state. Briefly, for 2022, the dry land, the non-irrigated cash rental rate is reported here. And this is a breakout here for from western to the eastern Nebraska. We have the breakout here. This is on a per acre estimate. For the entire area, for example, in central Nebraska, average reported was $120 an acre. It's up about 22% year over year. In addition to the average, we have what is called HAL. HAL stands for the average of the high grade, average of the overall average for the area, or average of the low grade. Average of the high grade and low grade, what that relates to is the average of the upper third and the upper and the lower third of cash rental rates. So the folks that take our cash rent survey, we ask them, what do you estimate the lower third of cash rent is in your area? What do you estimate the upper third is? What do you estimate the overall average is? So based on these estimates, we summarize the information. On dryland cropland, they traditionally trended higher than the prior year. Without doubt, the value of what we're doing, corn, soybeans, wheat, other crops grown in the state are much higher. Also, a bigger concern this year is that rising input expenses, especially with fertilizer, nitrogen, phosphorus, potash, whatever you might have, NPK, the big three. So trying to figure out how to navigate through those things have been a challenge for those folks that are working in the industry. In addition to the dryland cash rental rates, we have what is referred to as the irrigated or the center pivot irrigated cash rental rates. The center pivot irrigated cash rental rates that we have summarized here on this slide, this is breaking it down by region once again. This assumes that the landlord owns the entire irrigation system. So if the tenant is providing, say, a pump or a power unit or even a pivot, under these cases, the cash rental rates would reflect that, and you would account for that in the cash rent. An example, if a tenant provides a power unit, maybe you take off 10 to 15 bucks an acre off the cash rent to account for the fact the tenant is the one that's providing the engine. They're responsible for the upkeep, whatever the case might be. Now the range on the center pivot irrigated cash rental rates, this is a breakout once again from the low grade to the high grade with the overall average. The low third average, for example, in the central district was 225 an acre. The upper third was 335, and the overall average for the area was approximately 275. This gives us a pretty good breakdown to show that there can be a lot of factors that influence the quality of the land, quality of the range on the land. So keep these numbers in fact. You have to truly assess how good is the property. Is it a nice square piece that's fairly flat? Do you have rolling hillsides in it that are somewhat sandy? Depending on what type of soil you have, drainage, water availability, quality of the irrigation water even. All these things really impact the cash rental rates. Briefly, you will find if you take a look at the preliminary estimates, we also have a breakdown on cash rental rates for cow-calf pairs on a per acre basis, in addition to the per pair. And with the per pair or per acre rate, it doesn't matter what rate someone is paying. What matters is related to these cash rental rates. What is someone willing to pay, or what is someone willing to accept? And what I mean by this is there's different ways. You can talk about the stocking units, the animal units, the cow-calf pair rates, the per acre rates. What are the big things to consider when it comes to the per pair or the cow-calf grazing on a per acre basis? Well, related to grazing land in Nebraska, the things to consider, we need to take a look at who's maintaining the fences. That's the first thing. You got to keep the livestock in. If the landlord's providing it or if the tenant's providing it, I think that would probably play into some of the cash rents. Tenants, if they're doing basic upkeep, maybe you got to dig in a post or two. Okay, someone went in a ditch and knocked a post out. That's one thing when you have minor upkeep. If you have major upkeep with respect to, okay, you had a quarter-mile of fence that's basically shot and it needs to be taken out and fully replaced. Allan and I'm pretty sure you'd agree with me on this point, we have always felt that major upgrades to the fence, the actual materials, that should be a landlord expense. Because remember, if the tenant would vacate the property, they're probably not going to take out a 5-strand barbed wire fence or a 3-strand or whatever the case is. They may take out a temporary fence around corn stalks, for example, but the permanent structures, you don't see them being removed quite as much. So with that being said, if the tenant is willing to actually put in the fence, we would encourage you, maybe if you're looking at the cash rents, let's say, for example, if we're looking at the Northeast, there's a pretty good breakout there from 76 to 52 per pair per month. Maybe you look at the lower side of the cash rental rate for the next year or two if the tenant's willing to provide their time and equipment and diesel and whatever else they may provide. Negotiate that in the cash rent because those improvements keep land up. Other things to consider: weeds, trees, unwanted brush or trees, water source. It's a very dry year. If it's a dry year and the well or the ditch goes dry that the cattle usually drink out of, how do we account for that in the cash rent? Well, with respect to the cash rent, you'd probably be in a situation where you may have to haul water if you don't have a well that's it's pumping air and it's not pumping water. All those things have to be accounted for. I don't care who keeps that up, but it needs to be accounted for in what we would consider a rate that is respective of the value associated with who is providing what. All right, so that was just a very brief overview on the cash rental rates related to land in Nebraska for the 2022 growing or grazing season. In addition to those cash rental rates, you can find the preliminary estimates on the Farm Real Estate website. And I will be posting my slides from this presentation. Give Ryan Evans a day or so, but he will be getting everything posted. And with that, we're also going to take a look here. What else is impacting Nebraska? Well, the first thing we got going on, and I know there are some areas that have picked up some rain here in the last 2 weeks, and maybe things are looking a little bit better than maybe what they were a month ago. Without a doubt, we have not seen the type of drought that we're starting to see. This that ugly red color when you see that, I think 2012. That's when things really get dry. Now, the greater western half of the United States is pretty darn dry. If you get into Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, while they're still in what we refer to as severe drought, that kind of orangish brown color, they used to be in a much worse degree of drought. And it's still dry. There's still parts of Montana where it is very, very dry. But how do we account for that in our leases if we don't have irrigated land or if you have grazing land? Well, you got to take into account the true productivity of the land. And if we zoom in here a little bit more, I would say, greater than 90+% of the state is in some type of drought, whether abnormally dry, moderate, severe, or even worse. It seems like kind of the greater central part of the state is in that somewhat severe drought, and other parts are in a little bit more what we might consider a moderate drought. Without a doubt, the cow-calf sector is going to be hampered by this quite a bit. Those cool season grasses rely on that snowpack and those spring rains and cool season temperatures to kind of regenerate over from dormancy. So when we talk about the cash rents, especially in the grazing, are you going to have a permit in there to, if the property, are you going to reduce the number of heads you might run on it? Or are you going to, for example, maybe only graze for 3.5 months instead of 5 months? Whatever the case is, I would suggest that you account for that in the cash rent. Maybe you come up with convert your 5-month rent to a per day rent. Maybe you just pay based on what the actual grazing land period is. Whatever the case is, you got to do what's best for the land because the land was here before us and it'll be here after us. So we're trying to figure out how to figure out cash rental rate that accounts for all these factors or forces impacting things. Another thing on the cropland side, just because you have a great crop price, if you don't have any production, you're still going to have being a deficit with respect to where you wish you might be. So you truly got to have that communication element that Allan Vyhnalek's talking about, and he'll just be getting started here in a few minutes. One idea, and I think I've floated different types of these in the last year or two on these webinars, is also as part of our regular land management information. Flexible cash leases. There are different ways to set up flex leases. There's no one tried and true standard you have to work by. Whatever works for you and whatever someone can agree upon is what the best thing is. When I say someone, I'm saying the landlord and the tenant. Basic idea behind a flex lease. If things are better than you'd hoped for, you're going to pay more in cash rent. If things are not as good as what you had hoped for, you're going to pay less. And in some ways, this is kind of how a crop share works. Okay, so we'll get started here on one basic example. I'm going to give an example for crops and actually two examples for cow-calf pairs. So the first example, let's say we have a farm here. They're paying $220 an acre. They traditionally raise about 150 bushel. I know prices are higher than this right now, but at the time of when I put these slides together, the planting time price guarantees, a 30-day futures price average that comes from crop insurance, was $5.90 a bushel. Now, prices this fall, when we looked at the cash price in Columbus this morning, it was, if it wasn't that, it was almost approaching $7.50 a bushel. But the idea behind this example is, how do we account for a cash rent when we have changing prices? Okay, now if you're in an area where drought isn't quite the concern what it is in some of the areas of the state where it's exceptional or worse, maybe you're focused a little bit more on the price. Well, on the left-hand side, we have a case where prices are actually higher. And with them being higher, we add some on to the cash rent based on the change and what actually happens to the price. $6.35 a bushel right here. And who knows? I have absolutely no idea what prices might be this fall. There's a lot of world events going on right now. And with these things, they're definitely influencing prices. Right-hand side of this chart, we have a case where prices are actually lower than we hoped for. And with that being said, we're going to shave some off the cash rent. In either case, I would suggest with the cash rent, you set a range inside of which it can flex. Maybe it can go all the way down to 200, and maybe it can go all the way up to 240. Maybe it can go all the way down to 180, and maybe it can go all the way up to 260. It needs to be inside a range, because if prices are, let's say, $8.50 a bushel for corn this fall, chances are, even on irrigated, if it is that dry, yields are going to be substantially down on even the irrigated, and probably even worse on the dry land. You can set up a flex lease based off of revenue if you like to, or off a yield, whatever works for the parties involved. We have one case right here. Here's a situation. We remember the per pair monthly rates. If you multiply them by 5, that would give you a cash rental rate. So say for example here, currently we're looking at about $275 a pair per cow-calf pair for the summer grazing season. And we expect the futures prices, when we look at the price of that calf, you know, if you have a calf weighing, say 650 pounds off the grass this fall, if you calve very early in the year, the value of the calf would probably be somewhat related to feeder cattle futures prices. So I have one example here where prices actually moved down. For whatever reason, they moved down this fall. And with that being said, if we set up a flex lease based on price, you could shave about 7% off the cash rent to account for that lower price. Other example we have here, if prices were actually higher than what we had hoped for, if that's the case, we look at a situation where we actually add some onto the cash rent to account for the fact that that calf is going to be worth more than what you had initially anticipated. Flex leases, if you're renting by the day instead of the season and you take cattle off after, say, 120 days instead of 150, if you're charging simply based on the number or the period of time in which the cattle are present at the site, that is another way to set up a flex lease. With that being said, that kind of wraps up my section here. And I hopefully, Alan, if you're on, you want to turn your camera on?
I am on.
Okay.
Hopefully you can hear me okay.
All right, well, we got you ready to go here for about the next 15 minutes, and then we'll do Q&A. So I'll go ahead and mute myself and just tell me the next time you want me to.
That's great. I don't know how. I'd like to see myself to see if I got this even set up right. Just a minute. There we go. All right, I do have it set up. Okay. All right, good. I want to make sure that was in the screen because I'm having to use my iPad instead of my regular laptop. So I want to look at this season and look at the management part of the lease and talk about how that would work in a positive or a good way. And my lighting on my face isn't all that good, so I'm going to turn just a little bit more. Okay, that's better. Okay, let's try that. Okay, so go on to the next slide, Jim. Oh, sorry, I can't get this to hold like I want to. Just a minute. All right, there we go. All right, now you go on the next slide. We're ready to go. So as Jim's already pointed out, and as if you've heard me before, you'll hear me say every time I give a talk, the communication is the key to a successful lease. When we have something go wrong with a lease, when Jim or I get phone calls about we're not happy with this lease, there's something wrong with it, we're not getting what we need to have it done, it's either because of bad communication or no communication. So let's talk about what needs to be reported. And tenants need to report these things to landlords regularly. Things like, did it rain? How much did it rain there? I mean, these last few showers have been really nice here in Southeast Nebraska, but quite honestly, they're really spotty. I mean, in one place you have an inch, in another place you have 30, 40, 100. So depends on where you're at, depends on what's going on. How's the weed pressure going? I mean, I know I was over at my mother-in-law's yesterday and was weeding her garden, and oh my gosh, the weeds are coming like crazy right now because it did finally shower. And so that's probably happening in our fields too, unless we have some kind of chemical down to control that. What's our disease or insect pressures look like? I mean, and especially as you go through this season, how will that change? And then other pertinent issues like what's happening with the crop prices. Jim mentioned that they're way up right now. The whole Russia-Ukraine thing has kind of messed that up. Go, Jim. I thought you lost a slide here. Let's go back. There you go. And then of course the whole expense thing has gone crazy. Fertilizers have doubled or tripled. Fuels basically doubled. Repairs are way up. Chemicals are way up. Everything is more expensive than it has been. So how do you know that even a higher income is really ending up into be more change in the farmer's pocket? I'm not sure that's can even be true. So the critical thing is communication. It's important even for cash leases, and make sure the landlord looks at the land sometime during the season, either person or virtually. If you have a landlord several states away and they're not making a trip out to Nebraska this summer, go take your cell phone and make a video of what's going on out there and send them the video if you can, either by email or by text message or somehow, anything. Just be sure that they know what's going on and can see what's going on. And I think it's particularly important after you had some kind of a extreme weather event like a flood or flooding conditions, really wet, or if you've had hail, that sort of thing. That's a great time to make sure that the landlord knows what's going on out there. So it's just some communication. You can't do it. You can't over communicate. It's really important. Okay, go ahead. Okay, so some other considerations. Well, and I don't have these slides labeled quite right, but some things we have to do for landlords and tenants is thinking about how we're going to effectively communicate. And the first key to that success is how well do you listen? And you have to seek first to understand before you can be understood. In other words, do not ask the other party to hear what you're saying unless you're willing to hear what they've got to say. And I would submit you got to hear what they've got to say first. So make sure you ask clarifying questions. If Jim says something that angers me, and he does that from time to time, just to try me out and get underneath my skin, then I have to make sure I stop and ask him further questions rather than just get angry. And I need to remind myself to do that so he quits. So if I treat the behavior differently, then the behavior will change. So I just have to make sure I take care of that from my end. And then over the last couple of years or so, both producers, landowners have been calling, what are we doing with the lease? What do we do with the lease? We've got, first we had the pandemic, which caused prices to rise. And then now we got the Ukraine-Russia conflict, which has caused this extreme shortage of wheat worldwide, which has put pressure on the corn worldwide, which is putting pressure on protein worldwide, the soybeans. And so we got all this stuff happening with that whole dynamic that's kind of messing things up. And so I think it's more important than ever to have good communication between landlords and tenants. Okay, next slide. So I think that the landlords also should be visiting with the tenants. You got to make sure that you schedule a time to make sure you go out there and look around and see what's going on. I particularly like late October or early September around Labor Day, because I think you got to go be outstanding in your field to see what your farm looks like, see what the stand is, see what the yield prospects are, just check out all these things. That's really important. And then the tenants, again, as I said before, you have to make sure the tenants know, let the operators, reports from the tenants. And then so make sure that the landlord needs to make sure those operators are communicating regularly, and you have to tell them you want better communication. I will run into landlords all the time that'll call me up or text me or email me and say, hey, my tenant doesn't tell me anything. I don't know what's going on out there. And I'm kind of going, but have you asked them? And when I ask them that question, have you asked your tenant to tell you what's going on? Most of the time they'll say, oh no, I don't want to bother them. Well, baloney. This is a business arrangement between two parties, and both parties need to party on, and both parties need to do their thing. And so if you're unhappy with the information you're getting, you ask them to communicate with you better. So we're talking about enough numbers here. We're talking about big enough stake in this operation. Where it's worth, most farms are worth, a lot of them are worth over $1 million. So, and most are at least $500,000. So if we're talking about a big asset, a major production asset here, there should be good communication between the landlord tenant and what's happening with that asset. That's my point, I guess. And even for cash leases, of course, it's going to happen for share leases because the tenant's asking the landlord to cover part of the expenses. But I'm even thinking about for a cash lease, it's important to keep the communication high, make sure that people are sharing what's going on. And if they don't, ask them to do it. Okay, next slide. Okay, so with this extraordinarily high prices, I mean, I don't think we're at $8 right now, but we could sell at 21 corn for $8 to an ethanol plant, for instance. And there's some extraordinary numbers going on out there. Do we need to adjust the leases for this year? Well, remember, let's be in the correct marketing year. $8 is not available for fall 22 crop, and that's at least we're working on right now. There's still good numbers available for this year's crop, but we just have to make sure we get into the right marketing year in terms of how we're pricing things. And so does a crop share lease ever need to be adjusted? I would submit probably not, because production risk is shared between landlords and tenants. It's a crop share. So therefore, the price risk is also shared and the yield risk is also shared. Everything is shared, so everything should be fine on a crop share. Don't worry about a crop share. Flexible leases should not necessarily need to be adjusted either, because as Jim described when he showed you the flexible lease example a few minutes ago, he's running numbers there that will adjust as either yield goes up or down or price goes up and down. So flexible leases should be in good shape. So the question becomes, what do you do with cash leases? Do you need to adjust the cash lease? Well, legally, probably can't, because you set a price and you sign the document, so the lease is done. It's going to be executed. Now, whatever the two parties agree to is fine. You do not have to necessarily follow the written lease if both parties agree on whatever that change happens to be. But I just ask people to remember that when commodity prices are going up, the tenant tends to get the better deal, because what happens with cash rents, if you're under a cash rent, is that they tend to lag behind. They'll go up, but it'll go up at a slower rate. When when commodity prices are going down, cash rents are going down too, but they're going down at a slower rate. So the tenants get the landlords get the better deal then. So just remember that this all adjusts over a period of time. It just may not seem very equitable this year, but over a period of time, it will adjust. And also remember that tenants have got unbelievable expenses coming right now. It's just crazy. the bottom line is, with diesel approaching $5 a bushel, $5 a gallon, if it's not $5 a gallon, and with fertilizer prices doubling and tripling, those expenses are just kind of out of sight. And in parts, if you can get them, they're usually, a 10-day wait, and it's incredible what you have to pay for just a simple sprocket or something like that. It's just, those numbers are way up there. Okay, we're ready to go on. So just remember that what one party thinks should not necessarily mean what happens. And so you have to always think about the gross. I truly think that the gross matters. I think we have to think about what the gross per acre is. In other words, if you have, let's look at this example, for instance, if you have a pivot irrigated cash rent at $350 an acre, which is within Jim's realm of possibility here for Eastern Nebraska, and you expect corn yields to be 200 bushels an acre, and that's probably a little light, but I'm just using an even number for easy calculation. And we're looking at, I set this up last Thursday or Friday, and 685 probably isn't even right anymore. It's probably in the low sevens now. But anyway, the 685 is close. You get gross revenue of 200 bushels times the 685 or $1,370 per acre. And so with a $350 rent, 350 divided by 1370 ends up to be a 25.6% of the gross goes to the rent. So the typical range in Nebraska is going to be 25 to 30, 33, 35 is probably a little high for corn. And so this is still within that range. And remember, when commodity prices are high, you're going to be lower in the range than when commodity prices are lower. So we're still in a good spot here if those are the kind of numbers you're looking at. Okay, so let's go on. That's just some things to consider. And then look at a soybean example. And here I used a dry land or a rain-fed soybean example. Rented $190 a bushel, $190 an acre. Dryland soybean APH is 40 to 40 bushels per acre. Price for fall beans is oddly enough $14 a bushel, or a little bit higher, might be right now. I use again a last fall number. And so your gross income is 40 times 14 or $560 an acre. And so the 190 divided by the 560 gives you a 33.9% of the gross goes to paying rent. And remember, the typical range is going to be 25 to 35, and maybe up to 38% on soybeans. Soybeans will be a little higher part of the range. Typically, soybeans probably be more like 28 to 35 or 37. So again, this is well within the range. 34% essentially is within that range. So if you always got to look at what's happening on the percent of gross, I think that's just a good number to kind of check. I'm not saying you set your rent based on that, and you set your rent on flex lease or something else, but this is just a way to check to see if you're in the right ballpark. And these two examples are kind of in the right ballpark. Okay, go ahead. Okay, pasture leases. As we've proved again in Nebraska, you better think ahead about the big three, which is in this case, we're thinking about fire, but also includes drought and hail. And we're still in the middle of a drought for West Central and Southwest, and even the Panhandle and Sandhills in Nebraska is all droughty still. So make sure fire, drought are all playing in here, and make sure the landlords need to be clear about how they manage the expectation for that pasture if something needs to happen because of fire, drought, and hail. I guess I'm thinking about drought when I talk about that. Are we going to lower the stocking rate, or because of drought? Are we going to pull cattle early because of drought? Those kind of things. I don't have good recommendations on what you do with a pasture lease. All I'm saying is have that discussion before the cattle go to pasture, so everybody's clear on what's going to happen. Because if you're not clear on what might happen, then ambiguity sets in, and that's where people start to lose trust, and pasture leases kind of go to heck in a handbasket. Just make sure that you have those conversations before you get to that lease, before that lease starts, about what's going to happen if the pasture's hailed out, or if there's a big drought continues and gets worse, or if your land's been damaged by fire and you can't get out there till almost July 1st because you got to let everything regrow. Let's have those conversations immediately. So and then the tenants need to make sure they report conditions. And especially in Eastern Nebraska here, they need to report if they have volunteer trees. And I'm thinking about red cedars when I talk about that. They're a problem because in my view, and I think Jim would agree with me, the cedar trees or trees in general, they aren't supposed to be out of pasture. I think that those are a landlord expense. The annual weeds, or the winter annual weeds like musk thistle, I think that's a tenant expense. So just make sure that you have that clear before that lease starts too, so that we know how those things are going to be handled. But be sure that the discussion is always on the big three: fire, drought, hail. Okay, ready to go on. So having a written lease is really imperative. It's not your grandpa's farm anymore. Handshake agreements, you know, and verbal handshake agreements can only be terminated once a year unless both parties agree. And termination must be given by September 1st of a year before the lease would start. So what I'm trying to say is 6 months prior to March 1st, handshake agreements or verbal agreements start on March 1st, 6 months prior to March 1st to September 1st. And if you need to terminate your lease, please use that date. If you have any questions about that, please type that in the question or the Q&A or the chat, and we'll get to those. And then make sure that you know fill in the blank lease like we're showing on the screen here is available at a website called aglease101.org. That's what the website looks like. And if you look in the upper right-hand corner, it says the document library. That's what you're going to pull up to get to that fill in the blank form that I showed you. There are going to be PDF forms like you see on this slide right here. The lease forms are on the right. There's some of the lease publication with additional information on the left. They're good stuff. It's good stuff to know about, good stuff to have. And you even have lease forms for buildings and machinery and for livestock and for crop shares and pasture leases. They're all there. Please use them. It's the best source we have for a fill in the blank form that will help you get a good written lease put in place. That's important. Let's go on, I think. Unless there's questions about one, let us know. Jim.
Okay, very good. So Allan just went through all of his material. I've been monitoring the questions. I haven't seen any come in. We had a few sent in. So, all right. Tell you what, Al, why don't you take the first question right here and I'll review the one that just came in the chat and we'll kind of go through these together, all right?
Okay, got it. All right. So the first question was, how do I approach conservation provisions in a grazing land lease, such as more aggressive rotation of pastures, cross fencing, or using alternative weed control practices? Meaning that I think this came from a landlord and they wanted their tenant to be more aggressive in how they did cross fencing and conservation and all this sort of thing. And I sent the person that sent this question in an email, and I hope that they look at their email and get back to me because I want to try and give them more direct response. But we have to make sure that the landlord and tenant agree on what's going to happen. Are they going to good communication between both parties? Do they both agree on the same approach to management of the property? Does the property currently have cross fencing? And if it does not, who's going to install and maintain the fence, the cross fence? So I think the landlord should be mostly responsible for installation. The tenant would be mostly responsible for maintaining it. That'd be my stance on that. And then what are the alternative methods of weed control? And I don't know what they meant by that, but it's just something that would be something that they need to work out between the two of them. So make sure that you have good communication on these issues and that these things can be handled relatively nicely. And most cross fencing and rotational grazing actually improve the productivity of the pasture and increase the stocking rate, quite honestly.
Right, oops. Okay, the next question we had, if a tenant does not pay a landlord in accordance with what is under the terms of the lease agreement, maybe they didn't pay on time or pay the amount that was due when it was supposed to be paid. Sometimes they paid in installments, but you pay half up front and half at the end of the lease. Does the lease continue until the termination date? What happens? Well, the first thing is in the lease, do you have a provision in there to deal with late payments? There may be cases where they still accept the late payment, but you might have an interest penalty on there to deter people from paying late. I know the majority of people that are on the call today are probably a landowner in Nebraska, but if you're joining from another state, other states have different provisions on how you handle that. Consult with an attorney because there are different ways to place liens on the growing crop or the livestock before they're sold or whatever. That gets beyond my ability and what Allan knows as well. And, attorneys are not a cheap option always, but a half-hour consultation, even if you get charged for it, can save you a lot of time and grief and no maybe it's just not the landlord, maybe it's just not the tenant, maybe it's, it's something else that happened. Whatever the case is, consider contacting a legal professional to understand your rights, responsibilities, and what can be done about it. So once again, always look at the lease. A good lease would have a provision in it on how to deal with late payment. Okay, with that, that brings us to the end of our prepared questions. From what I can see on my end, I have at least 3 questions. So why don't I read you the first one, Al, and if you want to go ahead and answer it, I'll read
a quick peek. Jim, I took a quick peek at them. It looks like I got the Q&A ones, at least the first 2 Q&As, and you got the chat one. So you can start wherever you want to.
All right, well, I'll read the Q&A. All right, is it typical for a tenant to report yields to a landlord under a cash lease? So basically, do I have to give you my yields? Al, if you're the landlord and we have a cash lease and it's not in that lease anywhere, it's stating anything about the yields, what happens?
Well, I mean, it's what you guys kind of agreed to. I've been talking for probably close to 10 years now that even with a cash lease, the yields should be reported back to the landowners, because when I hear landowners have frustration with how to set a lease arrangement, they never quite know what the yield is, so they don't know if their cash rent's high or low. If we want to have an equitable lease and set it up based on what's actually happening out there, then we better have that yield information reported. However, this person asked the question, said our landlord is great at coffee shop talking, and I understand that. So I think if you're sharing that information, the information between the landlord and the tenant should be just like a doctor and patient relationship. It should not be shared. And so I would ask the landlord to say, hey, I'll give you the lease information, but keep your mouth trap shut. It doesn't be shared. It's you and your families. That's your business. That's our business decision. That's our business information, not decision, but information. And so let's treat it as a true business type of thing. So let's make sure that, anyway, I think that, yes, it should be shared. And if the tenant's unwilling to do that, I think you could even write it in the lease that they need to share it. And what I would share, however, is I would share the crop insurance, the 10-year APH on a crop insurance, or the crop insurance APH information. And that's what I would share. But I would ask the landlord not to share that at the coffee shop.
And the other thing Al mentioned, you can put it in the lease. You can put whatever in the lease that you want to put in there. 1, is it reasonable? And 2, can you find someone to agree to it? If a landlord wishes to place in the lease that they'd like to see a copy of the crop insurance information that goes in the falls to verify yields, they can put that in there. If a tenant wants to put in there that they are requiring the landlord to hold that information confidential, not be passing it around to every person in the county looking for a new tenant, they can put that in there. It's what do both parties agree upon. All right, next question, I'll read it off for y'all. When it comes to spraying noxious weeds, you might have Canadian thistles, common mullein. Is that a landlord or a tenant expense under a cash lease when it comes to grazing land, I believe? We're
assuming pasture when you write that. I mean, again, Jim just gave the official answer is whatever the tenant and the landlord agree to. I think that some of these weed things should be a tenant expense, personally. I think the tree removal, eastern red cedars, locusts, those kind of things, that should be a landlord expense, but I think that the weeds should be controlled by the tenant. But it's not what I think. It's important what everybody agrees to. Jim, I don't know if you have anything to answer that or not.
My other comment is if you have a new tenant coming onto the property, and this thing looks like they're commercially raising thistle seed instead of actually being a grazing land parcel, that is one matter that, under that case where it's just exceptional property in terms of the amount of weeds, maybe that's a landlord expense. Now, if this is a fairly well-maintained property and you have more of that, what I would consider kind of a maintenance weed control where, okay, you have a thistle here, you have, whatever, 1 per acre or something. That's a lot different. So, same thing with weed control, cedar tree control. If you know you have an issue at the property, you don't want to pay for it, but you have a tenant that's willing to work with you. Maybe you discount the cash rent to account for the fact that they take their skid steer out there and start pushing trees over for, 3 days straight. Diesel's whatever, $4 or $5 a gallon. I mean, all that stuff adds up, plus their time. All right, next question. I think I'll just keep reading them. Okay, so Al, you have a situation where you have a landlord who has not necessarily communicated the best. Currently, they have a farmer on the property. The farmer owns a pivot. They have had an oral lease for the past 6 years. Is it too late at this point in the year to discuss a potential increase in the rental price if you have a verbal lease?
What, do you want me to make a comment about that?
Yeah.
I am a landlord who has not communicated very well. Okay, well, so oral lease for 6 years. I assume the rate has not changed for 6 years. It's never too late to have that discussion. However, if the farmer says no, then you really can't push it any further because the lease went into effect March 1st. In some cases, farmers are willing to, or tenants are willing to renegotiate on the fly, if you will, in the middle of a crop year lease. Again, if he's agreeable to that, you can ask for something. I think we're quite a ways into the growing season now. I'm not sure that I would push that real hard, but if it's that important to you, then go. Otherwise, I just make the change for next year. Jimmy, I don't have anything to add or not, but
whatever is agreed to under the verbal lease, technically the terms do not have to be changed. But this just boils down to Al's communication thing. Under a verbal lease, if you want to make any changes, cash rental rate, whatever other provisions, you have to let the tenant know, or the tenant has to let the landlord know prior to September 1 of the year preceding or the year before the upcoming growing season. So it's too late technically, but once again, maybe they can make some considerations given some circumstances are occurring. Okay, next question, Alan. Have you observed any trend towards provisions in a grass lease that requires a tenant to remove trees up to a maximum cost each year? That's a very interesting question. So I'll back this up for a second. In irrigated cropland leases, it is not uncommon to see a tenant is responsible for the first so many 100 or 1,000 or whatever in repairs on the actual pivot. The question that we're being asked here is on grazing land leases, can you put a provision in there that the tenant is responsible for the first whatever so many 100 in expenses associated with removing cedar trees? I've never been asked that question before, but that might be a more a way to more equitably divide some of the expenses, that they go out there and they're willing to do the first 500 and work with that skid steer if they agree, okay, it's $60 an hour to run the mulcher on the front of the skid steer. That would be not an unreasonable way. That way the tenant isn't necessarily responsible for unlimited issues. It's one thing when you have just a small patch. It's another thing when it looks like you're raising a forest and it's supposed to be grazing land or something.
To me, go ahead. Well, are you done? Sorry.
Yeah, no, I said Al, go ahead.
Okay, so to me, it kind of depends on who has the equipment and how you're equipped to handle it. If the tenant's very well equipped to handle this sort of thing, then I think you take this and you run with it, give them so many dollars worth of stuff to do. But again, go back to Jim's previous point earlier where he said, and maybe you also give them a discount on the rent because they're doing that work for you because it's still a landowner expense. The other thing I want to comment, it came up before on the pasture weed question and now again with pasture trees, is that sometimes those pastures are so darn stinking rough that the only way to really get good control of the things that are causing you trouble is with airplanes. And I think if you have an airplane deal, I think that has to be discussed carefully because I'm not so sure that expense shouldn't be split somehow. So just make sure that that's something that is discussed before somebody goes out and hires an airplane to come in and spray the pasture.
All right. And there was another comment made on the noxious weeds. It sounds like there was a property here that when we were getting back to the noxious weeds on the grazing land, and maybe noxious weeds start appearing much more this spring because maybe the vigor of the grasses and what it typically is because of a kind of a slow spring. It sounds like a tenant rented a property that had exceptional weed issues. And that gets to Alan's point. It's about communication. Do you have a fairly well-maintained property or do you have a thing that looks like I jokingly said, are you commercially raising thistle seed, which you can actually buy weed seed. They use it at the university for research purposes, but obviously that's not desirable.
Well, to me, the subtle point that's being made here is that it is the responsibility of the landlord to give a tenant a property or a business that works well and that is in good shape and ready to be used. We don't necessarily rent a house just to a tenant. If the house is all beat up, we make sure the house gets fixed up and painted or whatever, just so it's habitable. We have to have a pasture that's habitable too. And so to me, some of the landlords have to jump in and take care of some of this stuff. I know it's expensive, but you got to get in there and get it taken care of somehow to give the tenant a place to start from that's reasonable and good. And then it's up to tenants to kind of continue that on, my view.
Okay, final question that I'm seeing here in the chat pane. It gets at the point, what are the key pieces of information to have related to what they term as a fair cash rental price on gravity irrigated cropland, and I believe what they refer to as the East District. The landlord or the landowner owns the actual irrigation pipes. What do you need to have? Well, and this person also gave the precursor that it sounds like they may have recently inherited or purchased this property. Well, I'll give my opinion and I'll let Al throw in his 2 chips on this too. But when it comes to setting up cash rent, if you're a new landowner for whatever reason, inheritance, purchasing it, doesn't matter. First thing, visit with the tenant, what are the things you need to be aware of related to that property? Okay, if you own a diesel engine that's pumping all the water, does that engine have issues? What kind of yields are raised on this property? Are they pretty custom for the county? Are they way above? Are they way below? You have to kind of understand that productivity of what you have out there. With the upkeep on the irrigation equipment, even if it is gravity irrigated, who's responsible for what associated with it? Okay, the tenant gets to use the pipe. Does that mean they have to drag all the pipe up and stack them in the corner of the field or whatever, or put them wherever they're stored at the end of the year? All those things would be things to negotiate. Al, do you have anything else to add?
Well, and even in the gravity irrigation systems, you have gates that have to replace every once in a while, and then there's the rubber gaskets to go between each section of pipe, and so those gaskets can go bad too at times, and they get old and they get cracks and they just fall apart. So there are clearly some upkeep issues even with gravity systems that have to be considered. But Jim's correct. I think it's saying that the gravity, his lease rates assumes the landowner owns all the equipment. And so that would be the gravity pipe and that sort of thing. So to that person to ask that question, catch my email address here at the end here and send me an email or give me a phone call. I'll be glad to visit with you about that some more.
All right, and I'll just answer this question really fast. I had a few more slides I wanted to get through on what we're going to cover in our next meeting. Final thing on verbal leases in Nebraska. If you wish to terminate a verbal lease, you must let the landlord or the land tenant, regardless of who it is, know prior to September 1st of the year before in which you plan to rent the property. An example, if you want to terminate or change any provisions in a verbal lease for 2023, you would need to let that individual know prior to September 1, 2022. It's 6 months prior to the cropland lease beginning. Most cropland leases start March 1, an example, March 1, 2023 through the end of February 2024. So it's usually a 1-year cycle. That applies to cropland leases. If you have a grazing land lease, that's only 5 months. That's not an annual lease. And those provisions are different under that.
So, well, yeah, the other comment quick on that is that I know you want to get to those final slides, but the other comment on that quick is that if it's you could still, termination has to be done by September 1st. Lease provisions can be anytime people agree to that, that's fine. But again, get a written lease, have everything written down, then you don't have to worry about those kind of things. That's why you want a written lease.
Yep. All right, final closing comments. Once again, Sam Zock with ZAG Land Company, new business outside of Columbus and Humphrey. Sam does a nice job at what he does. We appreciate his support. He's got his hands into a little bit different things. I've had I've heard from different people, they've talked to him in the past and they've been very happy with how he can handle it. Always look for good ag professionals across the state. If you're interested in helping us out with our annual land survey, something new that we're doing, we're allowing the public to help make some small donations. Sam made a small one for this webinar today. Help cover the mailing costs associated with our land survey. You can go to the go.unl.edu/land fund. It'll take you to a website where you can actually just take a credit card, and if you want to donate 20 bucks towards this, you like the information we're talking about, it helps us out a lot. The annual mailing of our survey goes out to a lot of people. And as you know, postage and printing and all that starts adding up. So you can also talk to a gal over, Barbara, over at the University of Nebraska Foundation, and she can help you out with things if you would like to make any other donations or whatever. And finally, we have our next meeting scheduled for August 15th, 2022. We will be doing it at noon Central Time. And with that, topics we're going to cover, talk a little bit more on the farm real estate survey. Remember, it's supposed to be coming out in really late June this year. Allan will be talking a little bit more in depth about, especially on these verbal lease provisions. And once again, you can submit any questions you'd like to get addressed. So with that, I'll leave our contact information up right here. If you'd like to get a hold of Allan or myself, our information is provided there. And we appreciate everyone's time. And with that, the recordings will be posted at cap.unl.edu/webinars. Brian Evans has put that in the chat. It's cap.unl.edu/webinars. I should probably throw on the next slide the next time we do that. But we appreciate Ryan Evans, Sam Zock, and everyone that helped us out today. Once again, if you have any questions, always stay in touch. Thank you.